We're back out here once again, and today we're talking about how you might be costing yourself some pretty easy bites simply by not using the right worm for the job. Stick around, we're going to talk all about it.
Okay, 6 pounds.
He's pretty heavy. Oops, this one here is a flat out toad. Oh yeah, that is a straight up toad, hon. And here is this video's featured comment. Congratulations! If you would like to have a chance to have your comment featured in an upcoming video, all you've got to do is leave a comment. And now, on with the video. Welcome back to Lowbrow Fishing, and today we're talking about making sure we have the right stick bait worm or Senko style bait paired up with the right presentation that we're trying to do. A lot of times we take our favorite worm, we take our favorite hook, we put the two together, and we hope for the best. But if you're not using the best worm for the job, you are costing yourself some pretty easy bites. So today we're going to kind of look at the different types of worms, and not just brands, but plastic types. Salted versus unsalted, how dense they are, how soft they are, and how each of these can relate to the presentations and techniques that we are trying to do. But first, before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that the fine folks over at KalKal are giving viewers of this channel a 40% discount from now until September 26th, 2024. It's my way of saying thank you for liking, subscribing, and watching these videos. I don't get anything out of it. I'm not getting money. I'm not getting sponsorship or any of that. It's just a 40% discount for you guys. It's my way of saying thanks for continuing to support this channel. Now, whenever we think of the different types of presentations that we want to do, a lot of times we don't really give a whole lot of consideration to how that bait's going to work in the water. When we think of a wacky rig, we think, well, it's a finesse presentation, right? It's a weightless finesse presentation. But when you think about it, you know you want that worm to behave a certain way. And in order to get that worm to behave a certain way, to really dial it in, you've got to have the right worm for the job. Something that I like to use whenever I'm fishing just a regular or weightless wacky rig, I want a soft worm that's pretty dense and got a lot of salt in it. And the salt content just isn't for the flavor, but a heavily salted worm actually falls faster. It's denser. And that salt can attract those fish and get them to bite and hold on just a bit longer. Now, what am I using? Well, I'm using a Senko. Now, I know I went in a video not too long ago bashing these and saying that they weren't the end-all be-all when it comes to stick baits. And I stand by that. But they do one thing, and they do one thing very well, and that is a wacky rig. They give me the action that I'm looking for on a weightless, true weightless finesse wacky rig. Now, if I'm using something like, well, good old Yum Dinger, these are cheaper, but they're also stiffer, and they have less plastic in them. They're not going to fall quite the way that I want to. Now, does that mean that I haven't caught fish using a Yum Dinger on a wacky rig? Oh, I certainly have. But if I'm trying to maximize that presentation, then something like this is not going to be what I'm going to grab first. Something like a Guggen Lunker Log is another one that I like to use. Now, those are probably the only instances that I'm really going to use those super soft worms, because a lot of times, as we know, they're one and done. Get a bite and that worm is done. But whenever we want that action, whenever we want that natural flap and that really good action, it's really hard to beat a Yamamoto Senko when it comes to a weightless wacky rig. If I'm doing something, say, like the Waco rig, and you guys have seen me do that before, I take just a 1/0 EWG, and I've got this 16th ounce or 32nd ounce tungsten nail weight. Now, for something like that, then I'm going to go ahead and use something like a Yum Dinger. Because when we start adding weight to that stick bait, when we start giving it a little bit of oomph to it, then we are going to see an increase in the action, the amount of movement or motion in the water that stick bait starts to have. My guy, Steve Rogers, recently did a video on different brands of worms and how they look when they fall as a weightless wacky rig and given a little bit of weight. And the results were really surprising. The more weight we add, the more action we get out of all of them. Go check out that video. You'll see exactly what I mean. And this guy right here, then this becomes a major player if I'm doing something like a Waco rig, which you guys have seen me do. But for something like a Waco rig, my real favorite worm to use is a trick worm. And the reason why I like to use a trick worm, well, it's got that long, skinny tail. And the way that I'm fishing a Waco rig, I fish a little bit differently than I would fish a regular wacky rig. With a wacky rig, you cast it out there, and that flutter down is basically what you're looking for to entice those fish. And you pop it up, and then you let it flutter down. Where a wacky rig is fished very slow. A Waco rig, I'm fishing just a bit faster, and I'm using the action of that worm, the twirling and curling action of that worm, as well as the fall, to get those bites. So it's something that, I thought I would throw in there, something for you to consider whenever it is that you're picking the type of worm you want to use. Now, next up, what might be the most popular presentation or technique for the good old stick bait worm is a Texas rig. This is a typical weighted Texas rig. I've got a 1/4 ounce bullet weight, and I've got that worm rigged on a 4/0 EWG. And when it comes to something like that, I'm just basically dragging the bottom. So I can have a little bit more leeway when it comes to the type of worm that I'm using. And what I have on that is just a cream worm. This is $1.25, and think whatever you want to about a cheap old plastic. These catch fish. And for me, that's the period at the end of the sentence. Nothing more needs to be said. So I'm using them in a weighted situation, much like that wacky rig. But on a Texas rig, I'm actually dragging the bottom. So I'm not looking for any type of flapping action as much as I'm looking for just having something moving along the bottom. I can use it to entice those bass from maybe a little bit farther distance, because that rubbing sound that bait makes on the bottom, those bass's lateral lines, which are way more sensitive than you think they are, can actually pick that dragging up from a long ways away. They get closer and they see something that looks enticing. That's where the Texas rig really shines. And I'm also getting a little bit more leeway. Like I said, I don't necessarily have to have the softest worm. As a matter of fact, I tend to go with a worm that tends to be more durable. Is it salted? Well, we've got that bullet weight on there, so we really don't need to worry about the salt content as far as being dense and bringing that weight down. Now, if I'm fishing that worm weightless, which I tend to do a lot, a weightless Texas rigged worm, then you really want to give the consideration that same that you would for a wacky rig. You want it to be just a little bit softer. You want it to maybe have a little bit more motion in the water as it falls through that water column. So that's something else you might want to think about. But if I'm just dragging a worm and I'm using something like an 1/8 ounce, a 1/4 ounce, or even up to a 1/2 ounce or more bullet weight, I'm dragging it along the bottom, and I'm not really worried about how soft that worm is, especially given the violent strikes that I can get on a Texas rig. I don't want one and done a lot of times. Maybe this is where I can save a little bit of money. So the Texas rigged worm, like I said, it's not the way that the worm is floating down. It's not the way that the worm is wiggling or curling through the water. It's how it's moving across the bottom. That is how it's enticing those bass. So I can get away with a bit of a stiffer worm. I'm using yum dingers. I'm using cream worms. I'm using basically what I have. And I'm more concerned with maybe the color and the type of weight that I'm using and where I'm using that and how I'm going to work it, rather than the action of the worm underwater. Now, lastly, we want to look at a very common presentation, and this is obviously the shaky head, right? Now, in my lake, I don't get to fish a shaky head like this up shallow. I have to get pretty deep where that vegetation is pretty sparse. This is just your typical 1/4 flat head shaky head. And we know you cast this out there, and you don't even have to cast it very far if you're in the boat. You can a lot of times just drop it off to the side and let it hit the bottom, and then you work it. You tap that line, you stitch that line, you work that bait in place, and you get that worm's tail to wiggle. Now, the whole key to that is having that bait stand up in the water column. So obviously what I'm using is something like this. I'm obviously going to use an Elastic worm, something that floats. I may want to go with a saltless type of worm if I'm using something that's a bit longer, a paddle tail worm, an open pore worm, something along those lines. But I want that tail to stick up in the water because the action of that tail as it's sitting there, that's what draws those bass in. That's why we call it a shaky head. And a shaky head can be an exceptionally effective way to get those bass's attention. Now, if I'm fishing shallower in the hydrilla forest, obviously I'm going to use something like an SMH, a shaky my head from Z-Man that Belat. He's the one who came up with those. And the worm that he puts together with that works incredibly well. Those I will be imparting a little bit more movement to. I will actually be dragging them just a little bit to try to get that worm tail to shake as it comes through the hydrilla. Something like that can be exceptionally effective. So again, when it comes to the type of bait that I'm using, it comes to the different presentations that I'm using, it comes to how I want to work that worm in the water, I'm constantly thinking about what do I want that worm to do? How am I hoping that worm works in the water? What is my goal? And I just don't throw any worm that I have on there. We normally think, oh, the color is the most important thing. And that is not necessarily true. While the color can be important in certain situations, it's not as important as the way that worm behaves when it's underwater. So think about that. The next time you're out on the water, think about how you want that worm to behave and pair the right worm up for the job. So there you have it, an in-depth view on the different types of worms and how I feel they best pair up with different presentations. You might want something different out of your technique, but if you do, make sure you have the right worm for the job. Doing so will not only maximize your efficiency, it maximizes the ability of that presentation to catch fish. And in the end, that's what we really want. Thanks for watching Lowbrow Fishing. We'll catch you in the next one.